morning, everyone. So we are closing in on 1 week until I start the new job. It is Friday, February 8th. So I have about a week and a couple days. And I thought to start off this video, I would discuss some of the questions I have or the things I'm curious about that I won't learn until I get on the job. And throughout this video, I'll be doing the snippets or a vlog style of my first days, what I'm learning, etc. And hopefully, within this video, I can answer some or all of the questions that I have, or at least the beginnings of answering those questions. So the questions that I have are, with the coding of ICD-10-CM and ICD-10-PCS, I don't know if the trauma registrars are the ones that are actually coding that information, as in they're going into the code book and finding the codes and then putting them in whatever form, or if they are going through what the coders, the medical coders, have assigned, and then we are just going through and verifying that that's correct. So we're doing that with the diagnosis codes and the PCS codes. I'm not really sure. And then with the external cause codes, again, same thing. Are the medical coders the ones that put it in? Or is it the trauma registrars that find those codes in the ICD-10-CM code book and then put them in to whatever form? I'm not entirely sure who is the one that's actually doing it. And then what are we putting this information into? Is it a work queue on Epic that's similar to the work queue that I work through in medical records, initial analysis, where it gives a list of all these encounters, and then you click on the specific encounter and then it takes you to a variation of the patient chart that has all of the information? And then I assume somewhere in there's a form that you put that information into and it automatically goes to the hospital's registry database? I'm not really sure. And then when you get to the hospital's registry database and then the state registry database, how does that work? Because when I was trying to do some research, I found on the Department of Health Services website for Wisconsin, they do have a document that shows what the inclusion criteria is for trauma cases. So what the state deems a trauma case. What needs to be present in that medical report to have the state identify it as or accept it as a trauma case. And that is really helpful information. But is that the same inclusion criteria as the hospital? Or is the hospital a little bit more broad than the state? And if so, what is the process for taking the information from the encounter and putting it into the hospital database and then the state database? Is it two separate processes where you go through everything for the hospital and then you start over again on the list and go through everything with the state? Or does it happen all at once where you have the encounter, you enter in everything for the hospital, and then you enter in everything for the state? How does that work? Or does it automatically populate into the state's form? I'm not really sure, and I'd like to know. Because then I can start figuring out what is the most efficient way to get this information into either database. And then also with the injury codes and the injury scale, etc., there's like 5 of them. Do the ER doctors or trauma doctors, are they the ones that assign those injury codes? Like, they already say what the Glasgow Coma Scale is, they already say what the trauma score is, etc. And then we as trauma registrars have to go through the medical documentation and make sure it's correct. and then we put in what the doctors put in unless there's some difference? Or are some of those trauma coding systems not assigned by the doctors, and it's up to the trauma registrars to go through that documentation and assign those injury codes or scores? I have no idea. So those are the sorts of questions I have that pertain specifically to trauma registry work. And then throughout this video, when I answer those questions, I'll make sure to put it somewhere on the screen, and then hopefully I'll be able to answer a lot of those questions. So let's go to future Kate on the first day. Hey everyone, so it is Tuesday, February 19th. I didn't get a chance to sit down and make this clip yesterday after work. So yesterday went very well, but it was, you know, the usual onboarding, orientation, the rules of the department, and punching in all that stuff, that logistical stuff. And then the rest of the time I was just reading, which was kind of boring, but hey. So when I got there, I went with the supervisor into her office and she went through all of the orientation stuff, which was a lot of the same stuff we covered in medical records with slight differences. And so far, it is quite different from medical records as far as we don't use our badge to swipe, to punch in. We use the phone to call in, which is interesting. I've never had to do that before. So that is how we punch in and out. And then for the people working at home, that is how they punch out. It's a pretty easy process, but I only did it when I punched out. And the supervisor doesn't have to do that because she's salary, so she doesn't need to punch in and out each day. So when I go back in on Wednesday is when I will learn the exact process, because I didn't do it quite right. I ended up punching myself out and then back in again. But oh well. And I didn't get my new badge, but that's okay. My current badge that says Health Information Clerk, that they still gave me access to our department. It just doesn't have the correct name on it, the title, position. So I'll be hopefully getting that on Wednesday. And my laptop arrived in the afternoon, but then we found out that they didn't have the correct program installed for email. Outlook 365 is not what I need on my laptop. I need an older version so that I have access to the calendar for our department, and Outlook 365 doesn't support that feature or something. I don't know. So they had to take the laptop back to IT, and then I won't be getting it until tomorrow, Wednesday. But with the laptop, it's a brand spanking new laptop, which is awesome. And in the departments, there are docks that you can plug the laptop into, which then gives you access to using the monitors and the keyboard and the mouse instead of doing all that through or literally on the laptop. So when I'm in the department, I can plug into that docking station and use both of the monitors and stuff. And then she did confirm when I work from home, which won't be for quite a few months. I'm going to assume it's going to be like 5-6 months. Once that happens, then I assume they set me up with 2 monitors and a keyboard and a mouse, and then I'll get a docking station for at home so then I can plug the laptop in. But I'll be able to be mobile with the laptop if I have to go to meetings, etc. So that's pretty cool. And Wisconsin America Trauma Society Data Dictionary, which is basically the manual that gives the list of every single field within the form for the database and explains what each of those things means. It's pretty dry information, but there's a lot of good stuff in there that pertains to where you get the information from and a ranking of the most reliable source of that information to the least reliable. So it may say lab results are the best resource to get this specific number or information, and then I'll say like, oh, H&P is the least or whatever. So I like that information, and especially it answers some of the questions that I have as far as where some of this information comes from when it gets to some of the coding systems. And then I also went into the Abbreviated Injury Scale, AIS, and that is the trauma coding system that they use for coding injuries and severity of those injuries. And I was reading through that course book, which was very interesting, very helpful, and I can't wait to actually use the code book along with using the patient charts to find that information. So as I was reading, when they were bringing up specific codes, I would go into the code book and find it to see what it looks like, how it's written, etc. So that was really good information. But I know majority of that information isn't going to stick by Wednesday, so it's going to be a lot of refreshing every time I come in until I'm actually doing it. Typing, navigating, looking at the EHR, and looking at the databases that we use. That's when I'll really start to comprehend and remember a lot of that information. So it was a good day, and it was actually a very quiet day because there were 3 other women in the department, other registrars, and they were only there for a little bit of time in the morning, and then they left for PTO for the rest of the day. So it was just me and the supervisor in our department. So it was nice and quiet, which was very nice. So the next day I go in is Wednesday, and I will be working with one of the other trauma registrars. And then there is another trauma registrar who is headquartered at one of our other sites that's about a half hour away. So on Friday, tentatively, is when I will be going to that location to train with her. And then there's another trauma registrar that is headquartered at a different hospital site that is a little bit closer within town. And I'll be going over there at some point for 1 or 2 days to train. So I will be visiting other sites to train a couple times, but my headquartered site is my hospital. Thank goodness. And then once a month they have their trauma conferences or meetings. I don't know when the next one is. I'll be finding out once I'm all set up with the calendar and the other computery stuff that I couldn't get set up until I have the laptop. And then what else? I think that was about it as far as nuts and bolts of what I did. So I can't wait for Wednesday because I'll actually be working with a trauma registrar, so I'll be asking questions, because as I was reading through, I was writing down questions, I was writing down important information that I thought I'd need to remember, so I can't wait to start going through some of those questions and getting answers and talking through some things. So I'm very excited, and I can't wait to start really getting into the meat of all of this. I'm so excited. And this is a really good department. Everyone I met so far is really nice, and I can't wait. It's going to be awesome. So I'll see y'all tomorrow or Friday. Good morning, everyone. So today it is Thursday, February 22nd, and I went to work yesterday. Didn't have time to do a sit down, but oh my goodness, am I so excited about this job. It's freaking awesome. So on Wednesday, I was coming in to work with a coworker to train, and what we decided to do was have her show me the process of what a trauma registrar does from start to finish, so then I can see the whole process all at once, see the big picture of how each of these components work together and where you get information from, etc., and just how you do all of these things. And she thought that was a great idea, and I'm so glad I did that because a lot of things make so much more sense now. So I'm trying to think of the questions that I posed at the very beginning of the video. I should probably watch that again. Okay, so I quick watched the video clip before that had all the questions, so I have them written down, but I think the best way is to describe the whole process that I went through yesterday, and then as I get to those portions that answer those questions, I'll put them on the screen. So the process that trauma registrars do is they have to run a report to see what trauma encounters have come up. And usually you do this at about a month range. So what we do is we go into Epic and there's a section called BI Launchpad. I've heard of that, never knew what it did, but you go to that section and then we already have it set up that it knows what filters to look for, so what diagnosis codes, etc. to look for. We just have to put in the date range, and then it will search for encounters that have the specific range of diagnosis codes and when those encounters, lengths of stay, etc. were coded. So we are looking for a month of encounters that have been coded, if that makes sense. So let's say for the month of January, we want to pull all of the encounters with our diagnosis codes that have been coded and completed. And then we get that report. It'll have a long list of the patient MRNs, their names, it'll have their hospital account number, and I think it has what site they're at or what specialty, etc. they were mainly hospitalized in, whatever. And we export that data and we put it into an Excel spreadsheet. Now we have Excel spreadsheets that are already set up where it says what site we're working on. We can add in the date range so we know everything within this Excel goes up to this date. And then we also have it color-coded so we know which cases have been looked at and which ones have not been looked at, so we know how far along we've gone on the list. So once we have that exported into the Excel sheet, then we have to go back into Epic and go to each specific encounter and look at the diagnosis codes that relate to an injury or a trauma to see if it does meet the inclusion criteria. So the medical coders are the ones that are assigning the diagnosis codes and the procedure codes, but we are specifically right now looking at the diagnosis codes to see if what they put in there is indeed the reason for why they came to the hospital and if it meets the inclusion criteria. And it seems like, at least the ones I went through, there's usually a handful of them that do not meet inclusion criteria and you're wondering why did the coder put this injury code in there. You're not entirely sure why they put that in there, or you can't find any evidence of that injury taking place or that it is a new injury and that was the reason for the visit. You're kind of wondering why did they do that. So we are going through the patient chart in specific areas, looking at all of the codes that have been assigned, seeing what the coders put down as a diagnosis. Then we are going into all of the H&Ps, ED provider notes, progress notes, imaging, op reports to see if there is definitive evidence of an injury, multiple injuries, etc. And if we can find that and it is definitive that yes, they fractured their tibia or whatever the case may be, then we can say yes, this meets the inclusion criteria, this is an encounter we have to abstract from. So then in our original Excel sheet, we would just change that encounter to red saying yes, they meet inclusion criteria. And then if they do not, then we just remove them from that Excel sheet and we put them in another one saying these have been excluded for these reasons. So then in the future, if it is audited, meaning the trauma coordinator for that site was going through all of those reports and wondering, why is this patient not in the registry, we can go to that list and say, oh, this is why. So once you have gone through the whole list for the month of all of the possible encounters that meet the inclusion criteria, and you've found all of the ones that do meet it, then at that point, we then go to the state registry program and we start abstracting data from the patient chart and putting it into that registry form. That is the only form we put in, or we put information into. The hospital doesn't have their own separate form. It all goes into the program that submits it to the state or to the national database. So it's all combined in one place. And when you go into that program or that registry, everything is color coded so you know what is required by the state, what is required by the National Trauma Database, and then what is optional, meaning your site specifically wants this, but it isn't required by the state or the national database. So then as you start to abstract, you will have to get all of the patient demographic info, information from the EMS run report, and where the injury took place. You're going to be gathering all that data, and they want to know, when did EMS arrive, when were they dispatched, when did they arrive, when did they arrive at the ED, and then they go into the information that that EMS gets, so the blood pressure, respiration rate, etc. They have all that information. The Glasgow Coma Scale, they get all of that information. And the registry database program will already start assigning and calculating some of those trauma codes, the injury scale, etc. They'll start calculating those so we don't have to do it. But the program does that for us. And then we gather even more data about once they came into the ED, etc. And we put all of that information in. And we put in the diagnosis codes that were assigned. And if we realize that, I don't quite agree with this specific diagnosis code or this external cause code, etc., we are able to make those changes if we need to, just in our database. And then we have all these different tabs that give patient info. I don't remember all the different tabs, but it has every single section of the patient chart, essentially, that needs to be put into the database. And then you just go through all those tabs and complete all that information. And the only code or codes we as trauma registrars have to assign is the Abbreviated Injury Scale, AIS. That is the only one that we have to go into a code book and we have to assign it ourselves. So that coding system gives the place of injury, meaning within the body, what body system, body part, etc. is injured, how is it injured, that sort of thing, describing what the injury is, and then the severity of that injury. Now, we don't have to know what the threshold of each level severity is, so what dictates a moderate injury versus a critical injury, etc. We don't have to know that. The code book already has each level and describes what each level is per the injury, so we don't have to understand that severity scale. But we do have to go into the AIS code book and assign those codes per what the injury or injuries are. And then once that is all done, then you complete it and it gets saved to the registry, and then you go on to your next encounter that met inclusion criteria and you start abstracting that information again. So it is very interesting work, and I really, really like the case finding section, which is when you run that initial report and you go through the patient chart to see if it meets inclusion criteria. That is my favorite so far, because that's what I actually got to do on my own a little bit yesterday, and I found that to be a lot of fun, to look at the patient chart and try and figure out Why was this diagnosis code assigned? Where did they get this information from? And hanging out in those gray areas of, does this meet inclusion criteria or not? And trying to figure out where that threshold is. Does it go into, this is a trauma and it should be included, or not so much? It's really interesting. So I'm hoping to come up with an example in one of the next videos of those gray areas and see if I can explain and describe that process of figuring out how to determine if it should be included in the registry and why there is a gray area with some of these inclusion criteria. It's really interesting and it's actually a lot of fun. So that is it in a nutshell. And tomorrow I will be at my hospital, and next week is when I'll be going to the other hospital that's about a half hour away to train with one of the other very experienced trauma registrars. So I think right now we're going to end the video here because we've hit about as much as we're going to do for the week. And I will come out with new videos as I'm learning new things and working on new skills that I think would be really interesting to talk about. So if you have any questions, post them in the comments below. And I just want y'all to know that I am so happy with this job, and I am so glad I found this job and I got this job. I think this is perfect for me. It's everything I wanted it to be, and I can't wait. So it's gonna be awesome. So I will see y'all in the next video, whenever that'll be. Bye!